Hey folks, so I wanted to make this video because there's a lot of talk about fascism these days. You hear that word a lot. All this talk about fascism, and especially among far left circles. A lot of people talk about fascism. You know, there's people that call Donald Trump a fascist. There's people that accuse people on the political left they don't agree with of being fascist. You know, there's all this talk about fascism. So let's just have a conversation here. It'll be a little bit of a longer video about what fascism actually is. Now, among the far left, among socialists, communists, anarchists, you generally have three definitions of fascism. Now, you get more of a, a social democratic view, kind of the mainline communist parties in most of the world, and they say that fascism is just the right wing, right? It's the right wing being authoritarian and dictatorial. You know, if the Republicans get a little bit more extreme, that they're fascists. That's generally the understanding, is that Republicans and conservatives, it's extreme right-wing authoritarianism. That's one definition. Then you have a definition that you hear among followers of Leon Trotsky. They'll talk about fascism being a mobilization of the middle class to attack the working class in a time of political crisis. If there's an uprising among the workers, the middle class will be mobilized to attack them. So that's the second definition of fascism that you get on the far left. And the third is one that you get from, like Maoist types and people that were associated with when the Communist Party was in its, what you might call its third period, or its more radical period after the 6th Congress of the Comintern International or the Communist International. And you get this definition of fascism where people say that fascism is people that say they're communists but they're not, right? They had the Communist Party referred to the Socialist Party as a social fascist party. You had this line that the socialists, the social democrats, and the Trotskyists, that they preached socialism but practiced fascism. You had China during the period of the Gang of Four accusing the Soviet Union of being socialist in words but fascist in deeds. So that's the three definitions that you've got of fascism. You've got people who think it's just a definition of right wing. You got Trotskyites saying it's the middle class being mobilized to attack the workers, and then on top of that you've got the Maoists and the ultra-left elements that say it's people that sound like communists but they're not. Well, all of these definitions have an element of truth in them, and all of them are wrong. Fascism, in essence, is violence and terror utilized to hold back historical progress and to destroy. When society enters a crisis, you get a mobilization, and you get really two poles. You'll get one pole that is progressive, that wants to build up and march into the future, and then you'll get another pole that kind of favors destruction and primitive human instincts. And their response to the crisis is that you need destruction and death. That's their response to a political crisis. And those two trends emerge whenever you have a crisis of capitalism. When people don't have jobs, when people are hungry, when there's fights among the ruling class, you get a progressive axis that wants to be constructive and build a new world, and you'll get a reactionary axis that wants to destroy and be primitive. And both of them are reacting to a crisis. When society can't function in the old way, when things just aren't going in a normal way, you'll get a destructive axis and a progressive axis, and they'll become more radical, and fascism is the ultimate of that destructive axis that wants to destroy in response to the crisis. The word fascism, it's not exactly the most accurate word. Now, Benito Mussolini invented the word, and he drew it from the fasces, the symbol of ancient Rome. He built this political movement. He was someone who was in the Socialist Party in Italy, but he thought they weren't radical enough, and then he became a big supporter of the First World War and World War I. And if you read the autobiography of Benito Mussolini, you read that book, it's all about violence. This man loved blood, he loved killing, he was kind of, a nationalist, he was, he had these economic, populist ideas, but in essence it was kill, 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 tear down, blood in the streets, the wheels of history turn just through blood. It's this obsession with violence, and he had broken with the Italian Socialist Party, he had supported World War I, and he had been basically this individual. He was associated with George Sorel and some of the syndicalist elements, and his black shirt fascisti went around beating up communists and they were essentially a gang of strike breakers. That's Italian fascism. But fascism is a phenomenon that goes back further. I would say that probably the first organization that would fit the definition of fascism would be the Ku Klux Klan. After the Civil War was over, African Americans were voting and all that, and there was a mobilization for destruction. Poor whites were mobilized to attack and prevent African Americans from voting, to attack the Union League, and to attack the Republican Party, the radical Republicans, which at that point were the left-wing party, and they were, registering people to vote, and they were associated with Marx. You have to remember that the Marxist August Willich and Joseph Wedemeyer at that time, the Republicans were the left-wing party. They were setting up in the South Reconstruction. You had the first public education in some of these southern areas. So the Ku Klux Klan was this violent, destructive mobilization to kind of beat back progress in the crisis of the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War. Or in Russia, prior to the Russian Revolution, when people were starting to get interested in socialist and communist ideas, you also had this mobilization called the Black Hundreds Party. And these were people in Russia that responded to, the general upsurge of strikes and protests among the peasants, and they responded to that by saying, well, no, the problem isn't capitalism, the problem is Jewish people. They engaged in pogroms and anti-Semitic violence, and the Black Hundreds Party was also an early kind of incarnation of fascism. But in essence, there is no fascist ideology, right? Mussolini presented himself in kind of a populist. A lot of his language was left-wing, nationalistic, German Nazism, or what they called National Socialism. It had this element of they were trying to restore Odin and Valhalla, and it was very, very backward and medieval looking, whereas the Italian fascists were talking about the futurism. The KKK, they thought they were knights in castles, and their name meant circle or something. This is all just words. Fascism is a mobilization of violence and terror in a time of crisis in the hopes of resolving the crisis with mass destruction. And all fascists seem to have this common theme. They all emphasize violence and killing, and they all essentially, it's just this kind of hateful bigotry, destructiveness, looking backward, and it's a mass movement of violence. People aren't fascists because of what they say. Fascism is what you do. One could say good things and be a fascist if the things that you do, not the things that you say, but the things that you do are themselves destructive. I like to compare it, there's an old episode of Superman, where Superman has a problem because somebody else is going around in a Superman costume and doing a lot of really, really bad things. Superman, he wears the Superman costume, he goes around, he does good things, but, there's this other guy in this other Superman costume going around doing bad things. That's kind of how you can understand the difference between fascism and communism. Fascists sound like communists sometimes. They talk about revolution, they talk about a mass movement, but what they do is very different. They're engaging in destruction. They're beating up oppressed people, they're killing people, they're murdering people. They're doing the exact opposite of what genuine communists are doing, which is organizing communities, feeding people, educating people. And some people even see a fascistic streak in the New Left. A lot of the New Left groups, instead of, one of their main targets was the communist parties of the world. They thought the communists were sellouts and phonies, and they hated Stalin, they hated the Soviet Union. A lot of these new left groups seem to focus exclusively on kind of trying to marginalize and attack the communist parties in the Western world. And a lot of them were explicitly, they thought that the labor movement was bad, and they thought that average Americans, like they were just Archie Bunker types. Right, average Americans, they don't get it. They're squares. They're not hip. They're all racist. And the New Left had a fascistic streak. Now, overall, the New Left was progressive. They were against the Vietnam War. They were in favor of the Civil Rights Movement. But the kind of anti-communist fixation that they had, and the way that they were all about, street heat and who cares about Lenin, who cares about Marx? We just have rallies and protests and beat people up. You could argue that maybe there was a fascistic streak in the Weatherman faction of Students for a Democratic Society. I think that argument could be made. But overall, the right-wing groups at the time were acting fascistically also. You had the rise of George Wallace and the KKK and all of that. But overall, fascism, the way it's been redefined by some of these liberal elements is fascism is anything that reeks of authoritarianism. But a lot of the things that in the public consciousness are associated with fascism were actually stolen from the far left. The German Nazis were trying to build a mass movement, and so they started appropriating some of the tactics and methods. For example, everyone knows the Nazis wore red armbands. Well, that was because the communists wore bright red armbands. That was, the Nazis had their salute. Well, the communists had their salute, the fist salute that comes out of the Paris Commune. Nazis had their anthems, The Nazis had a leader with a very distinct mustache. Well, that was because back then when you printed posters, they didn't have a lot of detail for facial details. So if you had a distinct mustache, Stalin and Lenin both had very distinct mustaches. So if anyone looked at a poster, they knew who that was supposed to be. They knew that mustache was Stalin, that mustache was Lenin. So of course, when Hitler came along, he had a very distinct mustache so that everyone knew who it was. And it was on the old propaganda posters, you could tell who the leader was. a lot of the things that are accused, you know, the new left or the postmodern anti-Marxist left accuses of being fascistic are just kind of political organizing tactics, most of which were developed by German social democrats and Marxists and were then appropriated by the fascist movement. So this notion that anyone who wears a military uniform is a fascist. Well, the Black Panthers wore military uniforms. Were they fascist? You know, feeding people in the community, building up pride in your neighborhood, and, you know, patriotism. You know, communists did that. You know, the Popular Front, they were doing all of that. So this notion that anything that kind of reeks of effective political organizing, anything that's populistic is fascist, is one of the greatest mistakes, I would say, of the new left. But overall, fascism is defined by action. Fascism is violence and terror against oppressed people. Fascism is lynch mobs. Fascism is, you know, you were talking about the Kristallnacht and the attacks on Jewish stores. That's what fascism is. Fascism is violence. It's lynchings, it's pogroms, it's, you know, attacks on oppressed people, it's destructive instincts, appealing to the most primitive and barbaric aspects of the human species, and just engaging in all-out acts of destruction in the hopes that doing so can prevent social progress. Destructive politics, that's the essence of what fascism is. Fascism is destructive politics, whereas socialism, real genuine socialism is about construction. It's about organizing the economy rationally and controlling the means of production so that society can continue to advance and that the irrationality of greed is eliminated. So that's the difference. Fascism is an attempt to resolve the capitalist crisis through destruction, and socialism is an attempt to seize control of society and resolve the capitalist crisis by seizing control of the economy and moving forward. That's the difference between the two ideologies, the two phenomena.